Starfleet vessels are not camouflaged. They do not hide. A Constitution-class starship crossing into uncharted space does so with running lights active, nacelles glowing, hull polished to reflect local stars. The official explanation frames this as confidence. A culture that has nothing to hide builds ships that announce themselves. The Federation does not skulk. It arrives openly, brightly, with saucer sections wide enough to be visible from planetary orbit before a single transmission is sent. But visibility is not neutrality. The shape of a starship determines who fires first. It determines whether a species perceives an arrival as diplomatic overture or territorial incursion. It determines how much time exists between detection and engagement, and whether that time is used for conversation or for targeting solutions. Starfleet hull design does not eliminate these calculations, it manipulates them. Every curve, every profile angle, every proportion of saucer to engineering hull encodes a message about capability and intent, and those messages are not universal. They translate differently depending on who is watching. The Federation assumes its aesthetic speaks for itself. Canon demonstrates that assumption breaks down the moment Starfleet crosses into space controlled by factions that do not share its reference points. The mechanism is this. Starfleet designs its vessels to project authority and deterrence while maintaining the appearance of peaceful intent, and it does so by embedding strategic signaling directly into form. The nacelles are lifted away from the hull to display warp capacity at a glance. The saucer dominates the silhouette to suggest crew population and non-military priority. The profile is symmetrical and open because asymmetry reads as predatory in many first contact scenarios studied by Federation xenopsychologists. These are not accidents, they are doctrine frozen into duranium. The problem is that this encoding works only when the observer already understands what Starfleet is trying to say. For species that interpret size as threat, brightness as aggression, or symmetry as rigidity, the same design choices trigger escalation instead of de-escalation. And Starfleet builds every ship the same way. Starfleet's design philosophy emerges from the institutional belief that exploration and defense are compatible goals achievable within a single hull. A Galaxy-class starship carries families, schools, arboretums, and holodecks, while simultaneously mounting enough firepower to disable a warbird. The saucer section is large not because it needs to be, but because it signals that most of the ship's volume is dedicated to habitation and research, not weapons. The neck connecting saucer to engineering hull is narrow and exposed, a structural choice that increases vulnerability but visually separates the crew spaces from the drive section. The warp nacelles are mounted on pylons extended outward and upward, away from the central mass. This configuration is less efficient than an integrated design. It introduces additional points of mechanical failure, but it makes warp capability unmistakable from any approach vector. These are calculated choices, optimized for a specific first contact outcome. Starfleet wants to be seen before it is heard, and it wants what is seen to communicate scale, technological sophistication, and non-hostility simultaneously. The theory is that a ship large enough to destroy you, but configured in a way that reveals its crew and limits its agility, will be perceived as defensively capable but not offensively optimized. The ship says, "We are strong enough that we do not need to hide, but we are not built to hunt you." This works when the other party knows what Starfleet is and what the Federation represents. It fails when they do not. The USS Enterprise encounters the Klingons for the first time in an era where warp-capable civilizations are rare and borders are still being drawn. The Klingons do not interpret the Enterprise's open profile as peaceful. They interpret it as arrogance. A ship that does not conceal itself is either foolish or so confident in its superiority that it does not need to. The nacelles lifted high above the hull do not read as non-threatening separation of propulsion from crew. They read as dominant posture, a display of strength held visibly above the body like a raised weapon. The saucer's width suggests not habitation, but the capacity to carry large numbers of troops or project power across a wide operational area. Starfleet's aesthetic designed to soften first contact, instead accelerates distrust. The Klingon response is not irrational. It is based on their own design logic. Klingon vessels are compact, aggressive, and built around a single forward-facing disruptor arc. The hull tapers toward the bow, the neck is thick and armored. The wings angle downward in a profile that maximizes forward firepower while minimizing cross-section during an attack run. The ship is a weapon that happens to carry a crew. When a Klingon commander sees a Federation starship, they see a hull that sacrifices maneuverability for size, that exposes critical systems on extended pylons, and that carries so much mass in non-combat sections that it can only be intended for occupation or long-term territorial presence. The Federation does not build its ships to occupy territory, but the ships look like they could. Starfleet does not adjust its designs for this misreading. Instead, it adds context through behavior. The Enterprise hails first. It holds position. It waits. Over time, the Klingons learn that Federation vessels do not strike without warning, that the large saucer sections really do contain civilians, and that the exposed nacelles are a structural choice rather than a taunt. But this learning period is measured in decades and punctuated by incidents where visibility leads to confrontation rather than conversation. The design does not prevent conflict. It sets the initial conditions under which conflict becomes more likely. And those conditions repeat every time Starfleet makes first contact with a species that has never seen a Constitution-class silhouette before. The Romulan Star Empire interprets Starfleet design through a different filter. Romulan warbirds are built around the principle of controlled reveal. They are large, but they conceal that size until the moment of engagement. The hull is a predatory bird in descent, wings folded until the disruptors charge. The cloaking device is not an accessory. It is the ship's primary strategic system, more important than shields or weapons, because it controls when and how the ship is perceived. To a Romulan strategist, a ship that cannot hide is a ship that has already lost the most important phase of engagement, the phase where you choose whether to be seen. When Romulans first observe Federation starships operating near the neutral zone, they do not see exploration vessels. They see a fleet that has chosen visibility as a form of intimidation. A cloaked ship can gather intelligence and withdraw without confrontation. A visible ship forces acknowledgement. It dares you to respond. The fact that Starfleet ships broadcast their positions, run active sensor sweeps, and illuminate their hulls with running lights is not interpreted as transparency. It is interpreted as a declaration that Starfleet does not fear being seen because it does not fear retaliation. The Romulans begin designing countermeasures optimized for this psychology. If Federation ships will not hide, Romulan tactics emphasize ambush from cloak, targeting the most visible elements first. The nacelles, lifted away from the hull, become priority targets. The wide saucer section becomes a liability in engagements where the first strike comes from an unknown vector. Starfleet's design language, intended to project confidence and openness, instead creates a tactical vulnerability that Romulan doctrine is specifically built to exploit. Starfleet does not respond by redesigning its ships. It responds by building more of them. The Galaxy-class program begins development in the 2,350 seconds with the explicit goal of creating a vessel capable of extended deep space operation without resupply. The ship is designed to be large enough to function as a mobile starbase, carrying not only crew but families, support staff, and the infrastructure necessary to sustain a community for years at a time. This is exploration doctrine, encoded into hull mass. The assumption is that a ship this large, this visibly committed to non-military functions, cannot be misinterpreted as a warship. Canon shows otherwise. When the Enterprise D makes first contact with species in the Beta Quadrant, the immediate response is often alarm. The ship is larger than many orbital stations. Its saucer section alone has more internal volume than some species' entire capital ships. The fact that much of this volume is dedicated to schools and civilian quarters is not immediately apparent from outside. What is apparent is that the Federation has built something massive, brought it into your space, and positioned it in a way that makes retreat or evasion difficult due to its own bulk. The Sheliak, the Gerada, and the Pakleds all respond to the Galaxy class with heightened threat assessment, despite Starfleet's diplomatic intentions. The Sheliak view the ship's size as an attempt to physically dominate negotiation space. The Gerada interpret the forward-facing deflector dish as a directed energy weapon array, because their own ships mount primary weapons in that position. The Pakleds simply assume that anything that large must be important and therefore worth attacking or stealing from. In none of these cases does the design achieve its intended psychological effect. But Starfleet does not have a fallback design language. It has one aesthetic doctrine, and that doctrine is applied uniformly across every class, from Runabout to Dreadnought. The Defiant class breaks this pattern, but only under extreme duress. Starfleet begins development of the Defiant in direct response to the Borg threat, a threat so severe that it justifies abandoning 60 years of design philosophy. The Defiant is small, compact, overgunned, and built with minimal habitation space. It has no saucer section. The nacelles are integrated into the hull. The profile is aggressive from every angle. It looks like what it is, a warship designed to deliver maximum firepower from a minimal cross-section. The Defiant is effective in combat. It is also politically destabilizing. When Starfleet deploys Defiant-class vessels to patrol borders or respond to threats, allied species that have spent decades learning to interpret Starfleet's design language suddenly see a new grammar. The Federation, which has always claimed that its ships are explorers first, has now built something that cannot be mistaken for anything other than a weapons platform. The Klingons view this as an admission of intent. The Romulans view it as confirmation of suspicion. Smaller species within the Federation begin to ask why Starfleet needs warships if the Federation is truly a peacekeeping institution. Starfleet Command restricts Defiant-class production and limits deployment to situations where combat is expected. This is not because the ship is ineffective. It is because the ship says something that Starfleet cannot afford to say broadly. The moment a Federation vessel looks like a weapon, the entire narrative around what Starfleet is and what it does begins to unravel. The institution depends on the belief that it explores first and defends second. The Defiant inverts that priority at the level of hull plating, and there is no way to explain that inversion without admitting that the previous design logic was either naive or deliberately misleading. So the Defiant remains an exception, used in specific contexts, never allowed to define the fleet. Contrast this with Cardassian design philosophy. Cardassian warships are overtly militaristic. The hull is angular, armored, and built around a central weapons platform with overlapping shield emitters. There is no pretense of exploration. The ship is a tool of the state, designed to project power, occupy systems, and enforce compliance. When a Cardassian Galore-class warship enters a system, there is no ambiguity about its purpose. The design does not invite conversation. It establishes dominance. This clarity has strategic value. Species encountering Cardassian vessels for the first time do not waste time interpreting intent. The intent is visible. The ship is a threat, and the response is calibrated accordingly. This eliminates the ambiguity that Starfleet's design creates, where the ship says one thing and the doctrine says another. A Galore class does not escalate through misunderstanding. It escalates because escalation is its function. Starfleet views this as a moral failure. The Cardassians view it as honesty. The real cost of Starfleet's design philosophy is not measured in destroyed ships. It is measured in the diplomatic overhead required to contextualize every arrival. When the Enterprise D arrives at a new world, the first transmission is not a greeting. It is an explanation of what the ship is and what it is not. The size must be justified. The weapons must be downplayed. The crew composition must be emphasized. The ship's appearance creates a problem that the crew must then solve through communication, and that communication must happen before trust can be established. This works when the other party is willing to listen. It fails when they are not. The Borg do not listen. The Borg do not interpret. They scan, assess, and adapt. When a Borg cube encounters a Federation starship, it does not care whether the saucer section contains families or whether the nacelles are positioned to signal non-aggression. It catalogs weapon systems, shield frequencies, and structural integrity, and it optimizes its approach accordingly. Starfleet's design language is meaningless to an intelligence that does not process symbolic communication. The Enterprise D's first engagement with the Borg at System J-25 reveals this with absolute clarity. The ship's size and firepower are irrelevant. The ship's appearance communicates nothing. The Borg cube does not escalate because it feels threatened. It does not de-escalate because it perceives peaceful intent. It simply continues its directive, and the Enterprise is an obstacle to be either assimilated or destroyed based purely on tactical efficiency. Starfleet has built its entire fleet around the assumption that appearance shapes engagement. The Borg demonstrate that this assumption is conditional. It works only when the other party interprets appearance the way Starfleet intends. When that condition fails, the design provides no advantage. The exposed nacelles become targets. The wide saucer becomes a surface area problem. The symmetry becomes predictability. And Starfleet has no alternative hulls ready. After Wolf 359, Starfleet begins limited production of designs optimized for combat rather than signaling. The Defiant is one result. The Akira class, Steamrunner class, and Saber class follow similar logic, trading profile visibility for tactical efficiency, but these ships are not mainline. They are supplements, deployed alongside Galaxy class and Nebula class vessels that still carry the old design language. The fleet remains a mixed message, some ships saying one thing and some ships saying another, and that inconsistency creates new problems. When the Dominion War begins, Allied forces and neutral observers struggle to assess Starfleet's actual strategic posture. Is the Federation a peacekeeping institution forced into war, or a military power that has always maintained warfighting capability beneath an exploratory exterior? The ship classes themselves give conflicting answers. A Defiant class and a Galaxy class operating in the same theater suggest two different doctrines, two different priorities, two different versions of what Starfleet is. The Federation's enemies exploit this inconsistency by targeting the older, more visible classes first, knowing that their destruction will have greater psychological impact because those ships are still understood by the Federation public as symbols of exploration, not war. The loss of the USS Odyssey to Jem'Hadar attack craft is strategically insignificant in terms of fleet tonnage. It is psychologically catastrophic. The Odyssey is a Galaxy class, the most visible representation of Starfleet's design philosophy, and it is destroyed by ships a fraction of its size using ramming attacks that ignore the symbolic language the Galaxy class is built to project. The Jem'Hadar do not care that the Odyssey's saucer section is full of non-combatants. They do not care that the nacelles are positioned to signal non-aggression. They see a large, slow target with predictable maneuvers, and they destroy it efficiently. Starfleet does not respond by retiring the Galaxy class. It responds by adding more armor, more weapons, and more tactical systems to the existing space frame. The ship becomes a hybrid, a design originally optimized for exploration now forced to function as a battleship. The modifications work in the sense that Galaxy-class vessels survive longer in combat. They fail in the sense that the ship no longer communicates the message it was built to send. A Galaxy class with phaser arrays covering every surface and quantum torpedoes loaded in rotary launchers is no longer a peaceful explorer. It is a mobile fortress that happens to have schools inside. This transformation reveals the core tension. Starfleet wants ships that can do everything, and it wants them to look like they prioritize the right things while still being capable of the wrong things if necessary. The design attempts to thread this gap by making capability visible but not primary, advanced but not threatening, large but not militaristic. The problem is that these distinctions collapse under pressure. When survival depends on firepower, the ship becomes a warship, regardless of what its saucer section contains. When first contact depends on interpretation, the ship's appearance determines the interaction regardless of what the crew intends. And Starfleet cannot redesign the fleet fast enough to keep up with how rapidly context changes. The pattern becomes clearest when examining species that build ships without any pretense of dual-use doctrine. The Breen, the Tholians, and the Sonner all produce vessels optimized for a single purpose, and their designs reflect that clarity. A Breen warship is a Breen warship. It does not carry families. It does not have botanical labs. It does not project mixed messages. When it arrives, everyone knows why. Starfleet looks at these designs and sees inflexibility. The Breen look at Starfleet's designs and see confusion. A ship that tries to be everything is, in practice, nothing when the situation demands specialization. The Galaxy class is too large to be an effective combat vessel in fleet engagements and too heavily armed to be taken seriously as a research platform by species that view weapons as fundamentally incompatible with scientific inquiry. It exists in a middle space that Starfleet insists is optimal, but that every other major power interprets as either indecision or deception. The misconception is that Starfleet designs its ships the way it does because of technological constraints or resource limitations. Canon demonstrates otherwise. The Federation has the industrial capacity to build specialized hulls. It has the engineering knowledge to design ships optimized for specific roles. It chooses not to because specialization would require admitting that some ships are warships, and admitting that would undermine the ideological foundation of the institution. Starfleet must believe that every ship is an explorer, because the Federation must believe that it does not maintain a standing military. The design language is not a compromise. It is a requirement of the political structure that Starfleet serves. This becomes a strategic liability the moment Starfleet faces an opponent that does not care about the Federation's internal political narrative. Consider the calculus from the Dominion's perspective. The founders observed Starfleet operations in the Alpha Quadrant for years before revealing themselves. They watch how Starfleet deploys, how it responds to threats, and how it justifies its actions. They see ships that are simultaneously too large to be scouts and too slow to be interceptors. They see a fleet built around the idea that presence equals deterrence, that being visible in a system prevents conflict rather than inviting it. The founders build the Jem'Hadar and their attack craft around the opposite principle. Be unseen until the moment of strike. Maximize speed and damage. Accept losses because the ship is disposable and the crew is replaceable. When these two doctrines collide, Starfleet's design philosophy fails comprehensively. The large visible ships become targets, the exposed nacelles become weaknesses. The wide saucer sections become surface area for torpedo spreads. Everything that Starfleet built into its hulls to communicate peaceful intent becomes a tactical disadvantage against an enemy that does not process symbolic language and does not value its own ships enough to care about losses. Starfleet adapts, but adaptation requires changing behavior, not design. The ships remain the same, the tactics shift. Galaxy-class vessels begin operating in battle groups instead of alone. Defiant-class escorts are assigned to protect larger vessels. Defensive screens are tightened, but the fundamental problem remains. The hulls were not built for this, and every engagement proves it. The deepest irony is that Starfleet's design language works best against enemies it does not need to fight. Species that interpret the Galaxy class as a peaceful explorer are generally species that are already inclined toward peaceful contact. They read the design correctly because they share the Federation's assumptions about what ships should look like and what their appearance should signify. The design is optimized for diplomacy with cultures that are already diplomatic, and it is least effective against cultures that Starfleet most urgently needs to deter. This is not an accident. It is the inevitable outcome of building ships to reinforce ideology rather than to solve problems. The retention question is not whether Starfleet's ships are effective. They are. The question is what they are effective at and whether that aligns with what Starfleet actually encounters. A Galaxy-class starship is an exceptional platform for long-term research, diplomatic hosting, and showing the flag in friendly or neutral space. It is a poor platform for rapid response, high-intensity combat, or first contact with hostile unknowns. Starfleet deploys it in all of these contexts anyway, because the institution cannot afford to maintain separate ship classes for separate missions without admitting that some missions are military and some are not. The design becomes the compromise that holds the institution together, and that means the design can never be optimized for any single function. It must always balance visibility and capability, presence and restraint, strength and approachability. These are not technical problems. They are political problems frozen into space frames, and they will never be fully resolved because resolving them would require Starfleet to choose what it is. The late-game clincher is the Sovereign class. Starfleet begins production of the Sovereign in the early 370s, concurrent with the Defiant program, but with a different goal. The Defiant is a warship that Starfleet pretends is an escort. The Sovereign is an attempt to build a next-generation explorer that happens to be able to fight a war. The ship is sleeker than the Galaxy class, with a smaller saucer and a more integrated engineering hull. The nacelles are still elevated but closer to the body. The profile is more aggressive without fully abandoning the explorer aesthetic. The ship is faster, more maneuverable, and carries heavier armament as a baseline rather than as a refit. The Sovereign class is the Federation's admission that the old design language no longer works. The ship is still recognizable as Starfleet, but it is Starfleet adjusted for a threat environment where visibility is not sufficient deterrence and where symbolic communication has failed too many times to remain doctrine. The Sovereign is what Starfleet builds when it accepts that appearance must include lethality as a primary signal, not a secondary one. But Starfleet does not retire the Galaxy class. It does not declare the old doctrine obsolete. It runs both designs in parallel, keeping the old aesthetic alive while introducing a new one, and the result is a fleet that still speaks two languages, one for itself and one for everyone else. The Enterprise E is assigned to the neutral zone. The Enterprise D's saucer section, recovered after the crash on Viridian 3, is not rebuilt into a new Galaxy class. The name is transferred to a Sovereign. This is not just a registry change, it is a symbolic shift. The most famous name in Starfleet, the ship that represents the institution to the Federation public and to allied species, is moved from an explorer that looks like an explorer to an explorer that looks like it could end you if necessary. The Romulans notice. The Klingons notice. The species along the Federation border that have spent decades calibrating their responses to Starfleet's design language now have to recalibrate. The new Enterprise does not arrive with the same psychological profile as the old one. It arrives sharper, faster, and more clearly capable of enforcing its presence. First contact psychology shifts accordingly. Species that might have challenged a Galaxy-class approach more carefully when a Sovereign class appears. Not because the ship is more powerful in absolute terms, though it is, but because the ship no longer pretends that combat is a secondary consideration. This is the mechanism operating at full scale. Starfleet's design language is not neutral. It sets the terms of engagement before a single word is spoken. When the design communicates exploration and openness, it invites certain responses. When the design communicates capability and readiness, it invites different responses. Starfleet has spent a century optimizing for the first message, and it is now learning in real time that the second message is often more useful. But the transition is incomplete, and incomplete transitions create the most dangerous ambiguity. When Starfleet sends a Sovereign class to make first contact and a Galaxy class to follow up, the species receiving these visits has to interpret mixed intent. Is the Federation showing restraint by sending the less threatening ship second? Or is it demonstrating that it has more capable assets held in reserve? Is the Galaxy class the real Starfleet? Or is the Sovereign? The Federation assumes the answer is obvious. The species being contacted does not have that context. They see two ship classes that suggest two doctrines, and they prepare for the worst possibility because that is the rational strategic choice. Starfleet's design language, built to reduce ambiguity, now generates it. The institution wanted ships that could do everything, so that it would never have to choose what kind of institution it was. Instead, it has created a fleet that forces every observer to guess, and most observers guess that Starfleet is more dangerous than it claims. They are not wrong. A Sovereign-class starship can sterilize a planetary surface. It can blockade a system. It can engage multiple capital ships simultaneously and win. It carries enough firepower to intimidate a Romulan warbird and enough scientific equipment to catalog a nebula. It is the most capable multi-role platform Starfleet has ever produced, and its existence proves that Starfleet has always had the capacity to build ships optimized for war. The Federation chose not to because the choice supported a political narrative. The moment that narrative became untenable, the ships changed. This reveals what the design language has always been, not a reflection of capability, but a reflection of acceptable self-perception. Starfleet builds ships that let the Federation believe it is peaceful, while maintaining the capacity to be otherwise. The ships are not designed to avoid war. They are designed to avoid looking like they expect war, which is not the same thing. And the galaxy does not care about the distinction. Recontextualize the opening claim. Starfleet vessels are not camouflaged. They do not hide. This is true, but the reason is not confidence. The reason is that Starfleet has built its entire institutional identity around the idea that it has nothing to hide, and that idea requires visibility. The ships must be seen because being seen is proof that the Federation is not acting in secret, not operating covert fleets, not building weapons platforms disguised as explorers. The design language is not for the species Starfleet encounters, it is for the Federation itself, a constant reminder projected into space that the institution is what it claims to be. But the hull does not control the doctrine. The doctrine controls the hull, and the doctrine has always contained both exploration and enforcement, both diplomacy and deterrence, both science and military capacity. The ships reflect this. They have always reflected this. The saucer section is large because it carries families, and because size is power. The nacelles are elevated because it signals non-aggression, and because elevation provides optimal warp field geometry. The weapons are present but not prominent, integrated but not hidden. Every choice serves two purposes, and the second purpose is always the one Starfleet does not say aloud. The mechanism is complete. Starfleet designs its ships to look like explorers because the Federation needs to believe that is what they are. The ships function as deterrents because every species capable of building starships understands that anything large enough to carry that many people and advanced enough to cross interstellar space can be used to destroy you. The design tries to soften that reality by making the capacity look secondary. But secondary does not mean absent, and the species Starfleet encounters are not naive enough to ignore what the ships can do in favor of what Starfleet says they are for. The shape of a starship determines the shape of first contact. Starfleet has chosen a shape that says we are explorers first, and that choice has consequences every time the second sentence is, and we are ready to defend that. The problem is that the second sentence is always implied, always present, and always interpreted by observers who do not owe Starfleet the benefit of the doubt. The ships look the way they do because the Federation cannot admit what they are, and the galaxy responds to what they are, not what they look like.